Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining another episode of the Racing Line podcast. Today, we've got something a little bit different from the first few episodes. Rather than doing a race review, we've actually got an interview with an Australian racer, someone who's gone overseas to race with and against the best, who has some hopefully unique and interesting perspectives on the European scene, and someone who can share a little bit of insight into the struggles that Australian drivers face when going overseas. So I'd like to introduce Joey Mawson. Thanks for jumping on the show, and we'll dive straight into it. So Joey, for those people who might be listening but don't know a whole lot about you, how would you describe yourself just as a day-to-day kind of guy?
Yeah, I would say I'm I guess a very healthy, conscious person. I look after my health a lot these days, and I spend a lot of my time training. Of course, we have to be fit as a racing driver, but in the recent years, especially, I've taken a big passion into it, and I dedicate a lot of my time away from the track into that aspect of my life.
And also, just taking into consideration, obviously, that you're from Australia. What was your earliest memories of racing before you actually started driving? What was kind of that catalyst that kind of got you interested or gave you the bug for motorsport?
I mean, I grew up watching motorsport, with my dad on TV. In those days, obviously, Schumacher was winning in the Ferrari, and in V8 supercars. That was the era of Mark Scape's, dominance. But I got the opportunity to try a go-kart when I was around 6 years old. One of my dad's mates had a go-kart and gave me a trial, and I absolutely loved it and got hooked. And yeah, basically from there, obviously it started as a hobby in go-karting, and then it slowly turned from a hobby into a dream, and then a profession.
And you're from Western Sydney, aren't you? Is that right? Like Welleral Parkway?
Yeah, I mean, more Liverpool way.
Yeah.
So yeah, Southwest Sydney.
So that track would have been maybe Eastern Creek?
It was actually Butterfly Farm for me, the first track.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's Butterfly Farm track.
It's a really good track to learn on, especially because it's so tight and technical. And yeah, so a lot of drivers, from New South Wales, particularly, they grew up driving around Eastern Creek at club level. They all kind of had their first taste of a go-kart at Butterfly Farm.
I wouldn't have picked that.
My brother out in a go-kart for the first time this week at the Butterfly Farm. Crazy. It's a good track, good little track.
Absolutely, man. It's good to learn on.
So just another, obviously you've answered the question about how you got into F1, but my earliest memory of you probably was 2016 or 17. And it was kind of, I was actually looking into Mick Schumacher, because it was kind of when everyone started saying, oh, Michael Schumacher's son's starting to race in whatever it was, F4 or something like that. And I was looking into the championship, and there was this guy that beat him a few times that had a James Hunt helmet on. And I ended up realizing that it was an Aussie guy. And I'm like, oh, this is awesome. We got an Aussie guy racing against, Mick Schumacher. But I was just wondering, where did that design come from? Or is there something about James Hunt that you like, or that you aspired towards, or what? I just wanted to know what the reason for the helmet was.
To be honest, so the story was, actually, I rocked up to the first race, and my helmet wasn't deemed, the safety standard wasn't up to the regulations, because they changed it at the last minute. So actually, half of the F4 grid, which is in total about 40 drivers, weren't allowed to use the helmet that they had. So in emergency, I bought a black carbon helmet, and I didn't have enough time to paint it. So I didn't want to have a plain, carbon looking helmet like half the grid did. So I wanted to have a little bit of design. So I decided to use the James Hunt design, because it was simple to be able to do with, a little bit of vinyl that was left over at the workshop at Banana Sport Racing.
Yeah.
And yeah, to be honest, it really turned out good, and a lot of people have asked me to keep using that design, because everyone loved it. But yeah, it was really cool. It was just perfectly fitting with the Van Amersfoort car and that era that I was in.
So you did the design yourself just with vinyl?
Yeah, correct. Just at the workshop with leftover vinyl.
Wow, that's so cool, eh? It's
Yeah,
like
Awesome.
so low tech for such a high tech industry.
I know, right?
exactly.
Considering you can spend like $3,000 getting, just the helmet painted, insane.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. I mean, the helmet itself just alone costs $5,500. So, and then I just stick it
Wow.
up with a bit of vinyl. But it turned out to look good. I loved it. It looked really good with the black car.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a cool design.
So obviously we've just touched on just karting just at the beginning of your career, but I was just doing a little bit of research into obviously your racing exploits. It seems like you raced in kind of the Rotax finals in Schumacher, a bit of European karting as well. So how did your karting career start and progress in Australia, and then what kind of prompted the move to Europe?
So basically, I started racing when I was around 7 years old. You know, it started at club level and then slowly grew to, doing regional karting, and then, started doing state championships a few years later. Yeah, I raced domestically in Australia till 2010, and then I had my first international race at Las Vegas.
Yep.
So that was really cool. It went really well. I ended up coming fifth. And I was leading the final at one point until I had an engine issue. So it was a really, really cool first experience. Then after that, I ended up going to the Rotax World Finals the year after, ended up qualifying for Australia. And that was an amazing experience again. And then after that, I did the Under-18s World Championship, and that kind of gave me the opportunity to establish connections to be able to race in Europe full-time the year after. So the year after, in 2013, I moved to Europe and started racing full-time internationally. And yeah, that was kind of the start of my European journey. I ended up being there for 8 years, so it was a really, really cool time.
Yeah, so as a fellow Western Sydney boy, and we obviously know racing's a really expensive sport, how big of a jump was it to get from Australian karting or racing to Europe in terms of finance?
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty significant jump. The thing is, in Europe, there's obviously a lot of drivers with budget, so a lot of drivers that are willing to bring so much budget. I was very fortunate that I had a really good deal with Top Kart, so I didn't end up being so expensive for me. But still, I was also fortunate to have some support from the Australian Motorsport Foundation to be able to bring some budget. And yeah, I think it's really beneficial to do karting in Europe. I mean, the level there is it's at another division compared to Australia. Although we have a great pool of talent here, it's just a different style, and I think it's really good to prepare a driver, for his career, whether he's coming back home to kart in Australia or to move into single seaters after.
So that connection that you had created with Top Kart, was that something that you'd built in Australia, and then kind of they gave you the opportunity to move over to Europe, or it was something that you built once you got to Europe?
So it was established through actually Tim Craig. I raced for Tim Craig, which was Kart One Racing, during my junior career in Australia, and he was the one that gave me the connection to be able to compete with Top Kart in the under-18s. Yep. Obviously, when I was racing there, I was with the factory team. Although we were basically like a customer and using the factory team, and that turned out to go really well. And from there, I was able to establish a connection and a deal to compete in Europe full time the year after.
Yeah, that's awesome.
What's the hardest thing about attracting and keeping those sponsors when you're racing? Yeah, I just imagine it would be really difficult to manage that, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, to be honest, when I look back now, yeah, I'm surprised I was able to handle the sponsors at that young age, because I'm still learning and improving and continuing to understand how to, service sponsors and give value back. Yeah, I mean, nowadays I have a sponsorship manager, so I'm really able to get a lot from him and learn a lot, and have a kind of corporate, what's the right word? Yeah, knowledge from a corporate kind of world.
Yeah, nice.
So just before we move into kind of going from karts into cars, so if there might be a young karter listening to this, and they're obviously racing in Australia, or they're competing at national events and things like that. What would you say is the biggest difference between someone who's karting in Australia with the national events, trying to make a career out of it, and then obviously those people that are doing it in Europe? Because I can understand there's like probably an infrastructure difference just with the amount of factory support that there seems to be in Europe, but then also just things like logistics. So for example, if you're a karter racing in Australia, this is something that you've experienced firsthand, like obviously there's a lot of money that it takes to fund even a season in karting, but then also the things like just the vast distances that people need to travel to race from Melbourne to Brisbane, or North Perth and things like that. Like Australia is so huge,
Yep.
whereas if you're racing in Europe, I feel like everything's a lot closer in that regard. So when we're talking about the finances of it, is the finance in the actual racing? Is the finance in obviously the logistics or the movement? And if someone was in Australia and was thinking about going and racing in Europe, from a financial point of view, would it be fairly similar, or is it at another level?
I can only really talk from the knowledge of my era, because since I've graduated from karting here, I mean, the karting scene in Australia has changed so much. I mean, the amount of budgets that people are spending, in the current era is unreal. I mean, you could nearly spend that budget in car racing, at Formula 4 level, what some people are spending in karting here.
Yeah.
But I would say most of the cost in Europe comes from being with the factory team and getting, factory support. Over there, for example, you race a race meeting with 2 chassis instead of just one. So you got 2 chassis, 2 engines, double the parts that you're using.
Assuming a lot more tires as well.
Exactly, a lot more tires as well. Everything's they just basically burn more money in all aspects. They're throwing everything at it there. I mean, some drivers even rock up to the race meeting with 3 chassis, test out which one they'll pick out of the 3, or even sometimes 4. And then have to.
From a financial point of view, is that like, we're talking for a season, in the high hundreds and thousands of dollars to do it at that level?
Easy. I think in Europe, some people in karting are spending 150,000.
Oh,
yeah,
crazy.
Insane.
Yeah, like I remember at the time that I was racing, if you wanted to race, for example, with Cosmic Factory Team, it was costing around 10,000 euros per race. But like, for example, if you did like the European Championships, it was 10,000 euro per round.
Wow, that's crazy.
I can imagine the jump into cars as well would be huge.
Yeah. It's I mean, in cars, you're also spending probably in Formula 4 300,000 euro easily.
Yeah, well.
But at least in F4 you're testing a lot, you're getting a lot of driving time. So compared to other championships that I've done, it's probably the championship that gives you most value for money.
Okay.
So
that's a good segue into kind of your movement from karting into car racing. So obviously you've done the karting in Europe, you had the support from Top Kart. Then at what point did you say, I want to give the car racing a go? And was it a decision that obviously you would have to have made, with your parents or with some kind of financial backing. But can you just talk us through kind of what your thought process was at that time, and then obviously thinking about the financial point of view of that as well?
Yeah. So I always had a goal of moving to cars around 16. The only reason I moved, later at a later age was mainly because of financial reasons. After I did that karting year, that 1 year in Europe in karting, the Australian Motorsport Foundation, which then became the CAMS Foundation, they decided to basically support me in the move to cars. So from that point of view, the financial support that I got from them went up a fair bit, which was basically what opened the door and allowed me the opportunity to finally make the move to car racing.
So that's a pretty good initiative. And just from, like, obviously you've kind of said that Formula 4 is, in the thousands, $400,000, I think it was, that you just said. So were you primarily funded by CAMS at that time to help you do that? Or you obviously still had, money coming in from some other sponsorship or from your parents, as well as all coming from CAMS?
Yeah, a lot of it was from CAMS. I still had some support from my parents, but I was fortunate at that time that CAMS took a big chunk of the budget, so my parents didn't have to put in as much because I had a real tough time in karting. I mean, a lot of a lot of red bills coming in karting to at home to be able to keep racing and going. So very grateful for them to be able to sacrifice so much for me. But I would say, once I moved on to cars, the financial stress towards my parents started to become less and less, which was a real blessing.
And were there many more at that time that you made the move into karting? Were there many more Australian drivers that were trying to make that jump?
To be honest, when I was in Europe, there wasn't many Aussies that were in Europe in karting. Actually, I was the only Aussie that was in karting at that time. There hadn't been a few drivers. There had been Aussies in the past that had been karting full time in Europe, but not for quite a few generations. The last time was probably in the early 2000s. And after myself, a lot of Aussies started to move over there full time. Drivers like Oscar Piastri and Jack Doohan. So it was really good to see. I mean, I guess it kind of started to show some pathway for the Aussie drivers that wanted the Formula One dream.
Even thinking about just the progression of that now, with like people like James Warden, I think he's signed up. Has he signed up to the Ferrari Academy? And he's still racing for Parallel.
Yep.
Which is awesome to see.
Yeah.
So then we move into, obviously you move into Formula 4, and this kind of blew my mind, because obviously when I was thinking about you, I always think about you and racing against Mick Schumacher, but I didn't really understand the scope of the people that you were racing against. Like, there's some people that we look at now that are racing in Europe in, lower in Formula 1, in Formula 2, but even, racing IndyCar, racing in Le Mans. Like, you've raced against some hardcore drivers. So obviously you move into Formula 4, you're racing against the likes of Harrison Newey, Pato Award. In your first season, you come fourth in the championship, you get 3 race wins. What are your memories of that initial French Formula 4 season?
I have mostly good memories. I managed to have a really, really good first weekend, kind of a dream debut. And it wasn't really expected, because all throughout testing, I was never really the quickest or showing, a good amount of pace. So I went into the first weekend hoping to just, crack into the top 5. And then I ended up qualifying on pole for my first race and winning 2 races out of the 3. Following that, I had a bit of an up and down season. It was a bit of a roller coaster. I had some good weekends, some really, really shocking weekends. But overall, in general, the first season in cars was good, and managed to turn a few heads, and particularly keep the sponsors happy, which was, CAMS Foundation, because obviously I was relying on them for a lot of support. So that gave me an opportunity to move into German F4 the following year.
What would you say was the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome going from karting and then, jumping into the F4 car? What was the biggest learning curve?
Very good question.
Obviously you're in a situation where you've done karting, for a couple of years in Australia, then overseas, and then you initially jump into the car. What was that initial like, oh, this is a little bit different to what I was expecting?
Yeah, it was. The first initial adaptation I didn't find was too difficult. But after settling in, to really get the last few tenths, I was always struggling in that regard, and particularly when it came to new tires. That was probably the hardest bit I found in my first year of karting, like car racing. Whenever I would put new tires on, I would barely improve. So that never showed much reflection in testing or in qualifying. But in general, I was always pretty strong in the races. But the difference, big difference I would say between karting and car racing is if you didn't qualify well in karting, you had the whole weekend to work yourself, forward in the heat races to then get a good position for the pre-final final. Whereas in car racing, you qualify and then that's where you start the race. So if you qualify bad, it already puts you, on the back foot.
Yeah, for sure. And on reflection, now that you're obviously a few years removed from obviously that initial feeling, did you ever kind of think, oh, that might have been the reason why I wasn't able to activate the tires at that particular time in your career?
Yeah, I think in general, on the new tires, I would always tend to overdrive the car. Yeah, I would say that was probably my biggest weakness in car racing, and probably why, in general over the season, the weekends that I struggled was always because I would qualify bad and then I would end up in, incidents by being in the mix.
Yeah.
Always the successful seasons is the ones where, my qualifying is on point and I'm always in the front row and basically staying out of trouble.
So then obviously your French F4 season gives you the opportunity to go and race in Germany in 2015. And so what team were you racing for in the French season? Was that the same team that you moved into Germany with, or a different setup?
So in French F4 was actually centrally based. So we all raced for the same team.
Okay.
The whole championship was run by the French Academy, FFSA. So all the cars were built at the one workshop. And then, we would swap engineers basically every 2 races. All the drivers would swap engineers. So it was kind of like an entry level to really get an understanding of car racing at a lower budget. That was the difference between French F4 and German F4.
Okay.
French F4 was probably around 140,000 euro at the time, whereas German F4 was 300, 400.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that French F4 was kind of designed with parity in mind, like to kind of give everyone the same opportunity.
Correct. Yeah.
So then obviously 2015, you jump into German F4. You come third in the championship, 5 wins. You race against, Lando, Norris, Robert Schwartzman, Mick Schumacher, even drivers like Job Van Oyter, Mattia Drudi that are racing in sports cars now. What was your, memories of that season?
It was, to be honest, it was a really cool season. We always had a lot of cars, and it kind of reminded me of karting in Europe. It was always very intense. A lot happening that year. I have very good memories of that season, and particularly now when I reflect on the drivers that I got to race against, it's pretty cool to see where some other drivers, have ended up.
And this is probably an interesting question, but you hear about sportsmen who have tried to make it in a particular industry, and they never kind of get to where the people that they were, playing against or racing against are at. And they kind of have a view of the sport that's a little bit jaded, just based on the fact that they've obviously been in the industry. They kind of see the inequality in opportunities that people get. But when you see kind of those people that you were racing against, some of them, like we said, in Formula One, DTM, sports cars, what's your overarching, feeling in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, look, I see it as the glass half full. I was very fortunate to be able to have the opportunity to even race in cars in the first place, and then after that for so many years in a row, for 8 years in a row in Europe. Of course, some drivers have gone on to make it to bigger and better things, but I'm blessed for the opportunities that I've had to race against them, and I'm still able to race in cars, present and live my dream. So yeah, I'm happy.
Is any of those drivers that you raced against that you kind of find yourself rooting for on a Sunday night?
Yeah, I would say Mick Schumacher. Mick Schumacher mainly that I've raced against.
That's kind of a good segue to go into 2016. So you go back to the German F4 Championship again, racing against Schumacher. You win that season. And I remember following that season with a little bit more detail, because I was kind of half hoping that Schumacher won, but at the same time, it's always good to have an Australian win as well. And obviously, you've been working towards that goal to race in cars for such a long time. You go through karting and then you get into the chance in F4 and you win the championship. What was that whole experience like? What was the feeling of winning the championship? And then what did it do for your prospects moving forward at that time?
So 2016 was actually a very crucial year. When the season started, Podium at the time had told me that, because I'd finished third the year before, got naturally going into the season, I was, going to be a contender. So they told me that if I didn't win the championship, then that was going to be the end of the line, the end of the support. And if I did win, then we would move up to F3 the following season. So it was a crucial year, and thankfully it worked out. Across the season we had a lot of success, and managed to have a really cool rivalry with Mick Schumacher. After I won the championship, I got a seat to do European F3 with Van Amersfoort. And yeah, I have to say, when you win the championship, for sure, a lot of people notice it. It opens a lot of doors and turns a lot of heads. So it was a very crucial point in my career, I would say.
How did an experience like that? I mean, obviously you're still really young at the time. You've just been told kind of it's a win it or bin it kind of year for you. What kind of or how should I say it? How did that pressure play on you? I mean, obviously you won the championship, and looking back on it now, obviously it seems fairly obvious that you rose to the occasion. But how did that pressure, make you feel at the beginning of the season, throughout the season as well? Was it something that you were constantly thinking about, or you had a strong enough mindset to just kind of, let the chips fall where they may?
I had a strong enough mindset to just, crack on. If anything, it motivated me to leave no stone unturned and give everything I had. I put the extra effort into my physical training, into my mindset. Didn't take any days off training. I was waking up to go train at 5:30 when it was cold in the winters. I just didn't want to leave any stone unturned, and wanted to, in my own mind, work harder than all my competitors. So on reflection, I probably found it as much more of a motivation.
Yeah, awesome. And then I'm just thinking about this now. So obviously you've gone to Europe, you're racing F4, kind of doing that whole thing. But on just from a personal level, like the day-to-day life of Joey Mawson at this time, what are you doing? Obviously you're showing up at race meetings and performing, but what was the day-to-day, routine or weekly routine of your life like during those years?
So when I was living in Holland, I would wake up early in the morning, get my training, done first thing, and then after that, I would spend generally each day during the week at the workshop. A lot of sim driving because Van Amersfoort had 3 sims at the time, so I would put a lot of hours into the sim. To the point where sometimes I'd beg the engineers to just let me drive and test and just do mileage. To be honest, away from that, it was, everything was just racing focused. I'd spend time with engineers, go and do debriefs with them, talk about things that, we wanted to analyze and improve, spend time with the mechanics as well, to really get the team, feeling like family. So,
And
yeah.
how did you find obviously you're in the sims, you're testing at that time, was the sim more to learn tracks or to be familiar with tracks, or there was, you were able to test different setups and then it would translate to, when you got onto the track as well? Was the simming that advanced at that stage?
It's pretty advanced. You just got to be very intelligent with how you use the sim, not focusing too much on lap times, but more focusing on, when you want to try stuff on the track, how can you improve it? What does it feel like? I use more of the sim as a tool to be able to try stuff and be like, that's interesting. I'd like to try that line when I get to the track. Well, I didn't think of this. Let's try this. The F3 drivers were using the sim extensively, and I would always actually jump in with the F3 drivers when I was in F4 and go training with them. And it gave me good confidence because, when I was training with those guys, generally I'd be on pace and sometimes even a bit quicker.
And then obviously I'm just looking also at your career now. So in 2016, you did just a couple of races in England in F3, just doing the British Trophy. So was that just kind of like a weekend thing or just a few races to get people, introduced to the category? What was the British Autumn Trophy at that time?
It was a last minute core deal that I got with Douglas Motorsport. It was a really good deal. So, I didn't have any other program that was clashing at the time, and any seat time in a racing car is always beneficial, especially the British F3 was a faster car, was kind of in between the FIA F3 and the F4. It was just a one-off weekend that I could go and compete and obviously try to get a good result. And we ended up just missing out on it. And not many people know the story, but I was actually meant to start the last race on pole and my rival was starting 7th. Basically the whole weekend I was just behind on points as I finished. I was most consistent, but I finished second. But the last race got fogged out. And because of that, I think it was Ina Mahmed that ended up winning it.
You were racing against the likes of Dan Ticktum, and even I saw Marcus Armstrong was in that in that series at that time as well, which is pretty cool.
Good old Dan Ticktum, eh?
Yeah, interesting character, mate.
he very much is.
Indeed. Look, he has a reputation off the track, but my experiences with him have been very positive. He's always been very polite to me and never nasty on track, so I don't have anything bad to say about him.
I think he's an awesome driver, to be honest with you. I think he's one of those real kind of doesn't give a crap kind of drivers, but he just seems to put his foot in it from a not marketing, but kind of sponsorship point of view. And kind of things that he says sometimes.
Is he still part of the Williams setup, or did they let him go?
He got dropped halfway through the year, I think.
Yeah, thought so.
Yeah,
that said something about being faster than Latifi.
Yeah, he said some silly comment. I mean,
oh, that's right.
Yeah, I think sometimes he's a little bit too vocal, which doesn't come across well. But the guy can drive.
So obviously, then we move into 2017. You jump into the European F3, and then just take me through obviously that jump. So I mean, earlier in the season, you had a few retirements early on. which might have just hampered the season a little bit. What was that experience like for you, 2017, jumping into a faster car at the time? And just talk us through that.
Yeah. So yeah, European F3 at that time was a really, really cool category. I mean, the budgets for that were, astronomical compared to F4. It was nearly double F4. So just to have the opportunity to compete and drive that car was amazing. And probably to this day, aside from the S5000, I would say the F3 was probably one of the coolest cars I've ever driven. The level of professionalism and quality in that car is unreal, and the downforce was just, it was nuts. The car is basically over aeroed, so it's got too much grip. Like it's got too much aero for the amount of power that it has. So you could take some corners that shouldn't be flat, completely flat. It was a weird feeling to be able to take a corner like Zandvoort, for example, that fast right-hander, completely flat. It's kind of like F1 is these days. It's just some corners, it's ridiculous how gripped up it is.
Some great drivers in the field too,
Yeah.
Schumacher, Eilert, Joe, Norris, some excellent drivers.
Absolutely. We had a really good generation at that time. I mean, it was at a very high level in European F3.
And this might sound like a negative person, but it's definitely not. But this is like, I'm just looking at your stats. So the years before that, you kind of come fourth in the championship, third in the championship, you win the championship, then you jump into European F3 now. Obviously, it's a much bigger stage. I mean, we're talking about the quality in the field, but then you go from, top threes throughout your junior career to then coming 13th in the championship. What kind of role, or how do you reflect on that season in particular? It might have just been that it was, some super quality drivers that you were racing against. But how do you reflect on that, just from a kind of a performance point of view?
Look, the season was up and down. I had some good moments, a lot of learning, but I think there were a lot of guys that win that year, in their second or third year of F3. And when you look at, for example, Mick Schumacher's career, generally it takes 2 years, to really conquer a category. Because, for example, when I jumped into F3, I'm competing against, drivers like Eilert or Maxi Gunter, who are in their second, third year. So you imagine, very high quality drivers, and they're more experienced than you. So I think on reflection, the season wasn't too bad, but what was probably a big shame was that I didn't get to do a second year and really have, a good crack with a second, at a second year's experience, and really see how I truly would have went then.
Well, and was that 2017 the last year of F3 as kind of the feeder before you went into F2 and then F1? Because obviously I think there was a time when they changed from F3 and then GP3 kind of took over it in that regard, and it became, I think it's called Euro Formula now or something like that. Was that the last year of European F3 as we know it?
No, it was a year after, so what would have been my second year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was your reason for the move after that year?
To GP3?
Yeah, that's right.
Actually, because my sponsors weren't so happy at Banana Sport at the time.
Yeah.
And I wasn't able to move to any other team due to the contract that I had. And because of that reason, basically if I had to do a second year in F3, I had to stay with Van Amersfoort, but my sponsors didn't want that. So they put me in GP3 for that reason.
And then what was when we're just talking about the performance of those cars, what was the difference between F3 at the time and then the GP3 car?
Yeah, so the GP3 was a lot heavier and had a lot more power, but obviously less grip, less downforce. The GP3 was around nearly 90 kilos heavier, which is a significant amount. But it had 150 horsepower more. So the F3 had around 240 horsepower. And the GP3 had, it was 390, 400. So yeah, 150, 160 horsepower more. So, fairly significant amount.
Was it funner to drive?
I would say the F3 was more fun to drive.
F3 was more fun to drive. Okay.
Yeah.
And in relation to like wheel to wheel racing, what kind of provided the better opportunity for, not better, but like the easier opportunity for overtaking and close racing?
Definitely GP3 by
Just
far.
because less downforce?
Less downforce. We had DRS, and also, the tires are wearing a lot more. So some people burn out their tires and fall backwards. Some people were good at tire conservation. In F3, we just had so much downforce and the tires hung on for so long. So, if you were even in pace, it was very difficult to pass someone.
And then in general, how do you reflect on that season? So 2018, when you look back on that, I mean, obviously it's fairly similar to the season before you jump into the category.
Yeah.
Straight into it. Obviously, you would have been racing with people that have been in the category for a bit longer than you. So what are your like just general, thoughts on that season on reflection?
To be honest, on reflection, I felt like I did a better job in GP3 than F3. Again, I was in my rookie season in GP3, but the team in general was struggling all season. And in those moments, the first goal that you have is to basically be much quicker than your teammates and ahead of them in all the races and sessions that you have. So in general, I was finishing much further ahead than my teammates and even managed to get 2 podiums. So yeah, the only thing on reflection that still hurts to this day is probably that race that I lost the victory on the last lap in Russia.
And then I mean it's so interesting, like you're just looking at where your career was progressing, in 2015, 16, 17. I mean, it's on this super upward trajectory, and then obviously 2000 and you move into European F3, you don't get the second season there. I mean, have you had that second season in F3 to once you'd kind of got your feet wet, and you probably would have had a much better year? Do you think that could have changed the trajectory of, at the very least, your European racing career if you were given that opportunity to do that second year once you'd got to know the car a bit better?
Absolutely. I mean, the last few years of my career, I've always, especially at that stage, I was basically just doing single years, so rookie years, and never really getting the opportunity to have that second year experience and really see where I'm truly at. Again, like look at Mick's Schumacher's career, his first year in F3, his first year in F2, I think he may have finished even outside the top 10 in the championship in those 2 years. But then the following year went on to win the championship. So, yeah.
Do you ever regret though? I mean, obviously they're a little bit out of control because you kind of have to kind of do what's going to keep the sponsors happy. But, is there regret when you think about what could have been? Or, I mean, obviously it's still an amazing journey, but I mean, how does that feel? Just, I mean, thinking also that you'd beaten him, earlier in your career.
Yeah.
Not, I want to say, convincing. Like you're convincing in that championship, and then you kind of, I mean, didn't get the opportunity to grow at the same level that he did.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say regrets because it was never really in my control. But in hindsight, things could have been, better if I had had a second year in F3 or GP3. Also to keep the sponsors happy and get some results. Because obviously when you're not getting results, everything just becomes a lot harder, to bring sponsors on board and, convince them to invest money into your career and your car.
And then obviously 2019, 2020, you were driving some Carrera Cup, Carrera Cup in Germany. doing some Super Cup races as well. How did you find that experience? I mean, it's completely different to what you had been doing before in the single seater. So just as a change in category, what was that experience like for you jumping into a GT car?
Yeah, look, it was. I found it a very difficult transition, particularly in the Porsches, because a lot of the technique and style that I'd learned in single seaters really doesn't work in a Porsche car. So I really had to kind of unlearn all my habits that I'd grew up driving with for many years before. With the Porsches, I really never really found them natural to be able to drive. I always would second guess myself. So it was a difficult stage in my career.
Was that also just because of like the kind of performance of the cars that you'd been driving for so long, and then you're jumping into something with, significantly less ability, and it kind of just probably takes a little bit of time to adapt to?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, especially when you've been driving single seaters for so long, some things that just have become such a habit are hard to get out of. Yeah.
Do you know any specific traits off the top of your head that you kind of had to try to
Not
do?
Yeah. I would say it was pretty much all in the braking, stopping the car and turning the car on the brake. In Porsche, it tends to have a bit of a messy style, whereas single seater, it's much more like a smooth transition where you bleed off the brake. It's a very neat style. Porsche's, that neat style just doesn't work. You just can't turn the car properly in that car. So yeah, I always struggled to really get that perfected, and even just feeling the limit of the car in the Porsche. I for example, when I jumped in the S5000, I went into the first race with no testing, no warm up, no shakedown. And, within 4 laps, I was like, wow, I can feel everything that's going on in this car. After a session, I could already feel what the limits were on the car. It just came so much more natural and easy for me.
That's probably a good segue to jump into your more recent exploits. Obviously, you did the Porsche for a year and a half. I think you end up coming back to race a Porsche car in Adelaide. Was it at the start of this year or last year? I can't remember exactly when it was. But then the S5000 opportunity pops up for you. I'm just trying to remember. Did you race a car last year in S5000 for a round or two? Or was it all just 2021?
It was just 2021.
And how did that opportunity come up?
So basically, Chris Landon, the series organizer, had contacted me just before I was going over for the Porsche. And at that time, I was still kind of trying to make it in GT. So I said, "Oh, I really appreciate the offer, but it doesn't make sense to spend my budget in single seaters at this stage." After the season in Porsche had finished, I wasn't really sure, what the next step was going to be. And I started to lose a bit of confidence as well in my ability. So when he came and contacted me in December, about the upcoming season, which was the 2021 season, I really wanted to have a go in it, and also just to see how I'd go driving a single seater again, because I'd struggled for so long in the Porsche. And it obviously turned out to become a really good season, and changed the trajectory in my career.
And I think at the beginning, were you planning to do the whole season, or was it just a few rounds to begin with, and then it turned into the whole campaign?
It was just to do the first race, to be honest, when I first did it. So it was a one-off. The first weekend went a lot better than expected, particularly given that, I went in not prepared, no testing, having a last-minute deal basically done while I was doing hotel quarantine from arriving back in Australia. I would say off the track last year was a crazy season with, not coming up with the budget and finding budget and getting the whole season together.
Yeah, that's kind of moves into my next question. So, I mean, in relation to the budgets that you were, used to in Europe, what's the kind of, you know, percentage or what kind of budget would you need for S5000 as a category? Is it a lot more manageable?
Yeah, I would say compared to Europe, yeah, indeed.
And what did I mean? Obviously, it's a completely different car with a completely different uh, theory behind the way it goes racing compared to what you were used to in Europe. But what are the biggest differences? Both negatively, but also the positive differences or the enjoyment with driving, that car.
I don't know if I have anything negative to say about the S5000. It's such a cool car, such a cool category. Yeah, I mean, if there's anything that people whinge about, it's always that the tires are too hard. But I enjoy it because that's what makes the cars move around and slide around. So that's what creates kind of the 80s vibe where we're really hustling and wrestling the cars. The horsepower that we have in S5000 is unreal. I like the look of the massive rear tires at the back, small tires on the front. And yeah, they're not the easiest cars to drive. There's a lot going on. The power is not very forgiving. But yeah, in overall, it's, aside from the F3, probably one of the coolest racing cars that I've driven. It's definitely the most fun I'm having in a race car.
It's so good to hear, considering that it's like such a new category and it's completely Australian. That's such a cool perspective to be able to hear. But then also, I mean, it's obviously still a very new category. Still growing it even within Australia. From your point of view, now that you've raced in it a year, how does the category grow? I mean, obviously it's going to happen somewhat naturally as well, but what things do you think the category could implement or do to increase its to increase its viability for young drivers?
Yep, I would say mainly keeping the budgets low, which is what they've been good at the moment. Yeah, I mean, most categories are so expensive in Australia. Even Porsche Carrera Cup, for example, I don't understand how the budgets are so expensive.
On average, what are we talking about for Carrera Cup?
Carrera Cup, when I was asking for offers, it's probably around $500,000.
Whoa,
jeez.
Yeah, it's like
yeah, even get to pass in that category.
I don't know how some people manage to raise the budget for it. It's unreal how expensive it is. So Porsche doesn't even, the S5000 doesn't go anywhere near that.
What's kind of just an average budget roughly for the S5000?
So at the moment, it was around 20,000 per round, but that's without the lease of the car. So yeah, I had a sponsor that was covering the lease last year. So I'm not sure what the budget would be without lease. But yeah, with the lease, but without the lease, it was 20K roughly per round.
And then obviously talking about the championship itself, I mean, it was a pretty awesome championship all year between yourself and Tom Randall. I mean, another young Australian driver who, again, tried to make it in Europe's come back. It's kind of got his foot in the door in supercars now, which is great to see. But what are your, reflections of that season, and also just from a competition point of view between the two of you? How does that rate in your career so far?
Yeah, no, it was really cool to be battling with Thomas. I mean, yeah, it's really good to see as well that he's progressed into V8s and made it to the really professional level. I had a great rivalry with him, and especially being teammates across the season, I was able to really learn from him in the early rounds and catch up. Yeah, so that was a good battle. I enjoyed racing against him.
That's awesome. And then obviously just the progression from that. So obviously you're back in Australia now. You're racing in S5000. Kind of what's your view on your career moving forward? What are what are your ambitions? What are you trying to get into at this stage? Is supercars, a realistic expectation for you to try and push into, or what are your goals in that regard?
So at the moment, my plan is to do S5000 for season 2.
Yeah.
I think beyond that, to make it in Australia, you have to be in V8 supercars. So I'd like to see how I'd adapt to that car. I mean, previously I struggled in the Porsches, but from what I've been told, the supercars are a completely different animal again. So I guess until I drive it and jump in it, I won't really know how I'm going to adapt. I know I can drive a single seater pretty well, but the question is whether I'd be able to adapt to a supercar. And
is that something that you're actively, or maybe not pursuing, because obviously you already got your plans for 2022 organized, but is that something that you're thinking about moving forward?
Correct.
Yeah,
definitely
awesome.
something in the pipeline.
Did COVID play any role in you deciding to stay here and not going back to Europe?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So then, obviously, just to finish up, I just thought I had just a few questions about Australians trying to move overseas, and we spoke earlier about seeing Piastri go overseas after you, and James Warden and that like. But obviously, to see more Australians making that plunge overseas, is there anything that you think that Australian motorsport can implement or do to make that transition more viable, or to make it a little bit easier? I mean, obviously the reality is it's half the world away, but just from your experience, is there anything that you think could be beneficial to helping us get more Australians overseas?
I think what the Motorsport Australia organization has organized now with the Ferrari Driver Academy shootout in here in Australia, I think that's already bridging the gap to Europe and enabling some young Aussie kids to have the opportunity to give it a crack in Europe. So I think more programs like that would be really what would fill that gap.
Awesome. Just to finish off, so obviously we've spoken about a few serious things, but something that I have a pet peeve with, and a few of my brothers who are part of the podcast as well, we tend to have an issue with, and I just want to get some driver opinions on it. It's completely BS, but when we're looking at a lot of our young drivers now, particularly in supercars, the thing that is becoming super frustrating is that their helmets don't have visors on them. I want to take, and I've, I don't know if you listened to the Below the Bonnet podcast with Caruso, but I'd sent Caruso a few messages saying you need to talk about this in supercars, and in his podcast, and he said, yeah, it's something that annoys me as well. I just want to get some proper drivers' perspectives. What is your view on the visorless helmet as an aesthetic thing?
Aesthetically, it definitely doesn't look good. But the reason why drivers do it is for the heat.
For the heat.
For the heat.
Do you think that's a good enough reason not to put a visor on?
Well, when you got a lot of television cameras and onboards like you do in V8s, probably not, because obviously you're getting a lot of footage. But I mean.
So when you're racing in the Bathurst 1000 in a couple of years, with Tom Randall in the same team, because you'd work together at BRM, will you be driving with a visorless helmet?
No. You won't see me with a visorless helmet. To be honest, you'd probably see me with the visor down in quali, and in the race it might be cracked slightly open.
See, it's like quarter crack.
Yeah, I'd say quarter crack, just to get that little bit of air, but so that you can't see my eyes.
No, that's it. I love it, mate.
Anthony's so traditional with everything.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't do the visorless helmet. It just reminds me too much of British touring cars. It's just anyway. It's not my thing. Put a bit of smoke on it.
I fully agree on it, man. Fully agree on it. It definitely just looks much more aesthetic when the visor's, that 3/4 crack.
100% agree, mate. I think we'll leave it there for tonight. Thanks so much for jumping on.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Very welcome, guys. Pleasure to be on.
Cheers, buddy. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank
mate.
you. Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to that podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, please give us a like on the video and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you're listening on any of our other podcasting networks, please share it with those people around you that you might think are interested. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we hope to have some more great content coming out next week. Thank you so much and have a great night.